In this video, we're going to look at sketching the cosine function, and it has a particular rule: y equals 1/2 cosine of 3x over 2. And we want to sketch that over what we might call a domain, or a given interval of negative 240 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 240. So the first things that we want to find out about this is what is the amplitude and what is the period of the graph, because they're really the key features of a cosine or indeed a sine graph that will help us sketch it well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to think about the amplitude. And the amplitude is related to the number that's multiplying the cosine function. So in this case we have a fraction which is a half multiplying cos. So the amplitude is equal to 1/2. So that's how far above and how far below the center line, which in this case is y equals 0, or the x-axis, that the graph will reach. The next thing we want to calculate is the period. The period has a formula, and that is that the period is found by calculating 360 divided by n, where n is the coefficient or the number multiplying x. So if we look at where x is, we can see that we have 3x over 2, which means n is going to equal 3 over 2. So that's the number that multiplies x for this rule. So when we're going to calculate the period, we now need to do 360 and divide it by 3 over 2. And then instead of dividing a fraction by a fraction, we like to multiply by the reciprocal. So we're going to have 360 multiplied by, and then we're going to have 2 over 3. So that's going to give us 360, and I'm going to divide by the 3 first, which will give 120, and then still multiply it by 2, which gives us a period of 120 multiplied by 2, which is 240. So that's the period, or how long it takes for the graph to complete one cycle. So with that information, we know that from negative 240 to 240 will fit in 2 cycles of this graph. And our sine and cosine have particular shapes, or basic shapes that we should know. And for cosine, we actually start up usually at y is 1, x is 0, and it goes down and then back up to complete one cycle. But with our knowledge of the amplitude, we know we're now going to start at 1/2 instead of 1. And we're going to take 240 instead of a normal 360 for the period. So that means that this graph, if we draw half a cycle, would look something like this. And then the other half that would fit on the other side would look something like that. So it's not quite perfect, but it will do the trick for this example. That's the full shape of the graph over 2 periods, or from negative 240 to 240 degrees. And now what we want to do is we want to start putting on the key features of this graph. So we'll start with a scale for the y-axis, because that is related to our amplitude. So we know that it's going to reach a maximum of 1/2 here, and the minimums are going to be negative 1/2 as their y value. So that's how far above and below the middle that the function gets to. And we knew that it took 240 degrees to do one cycle. So that means that over here, our endpoint's going to be at 240, and the y value there is positive 1/2. Over here, we're going to have the negative 240, but still positive 1/2 for the y value. Our point here on the y-axis is going to be x is 0, y is 1/2. And now we could think about the minimums. So this minimum here is going to be halfway between 2 maximums. So halfway between negative 240 and 0 is negative 120, and it's going to have negative 1/2 as its y value. And over here, this is going to be positive 120 and still negative 1/2 as the y value. The last things we've got are the 4 x-intercepts. So this x-intercept here is halfway between negative 420 and negative 120, which is negative 180, 0. And then here we're going to have negative 60, 0. And then over here we're going to have positive 60, 0. And our last key feature, which is this x-intercept, is going to be at 180, 0. So that's the full graph by hand. And now we'll just have a quick look at how we could get that graph up on the CAS calculator. So on the CAS calculator, we want to head into the main menu. Next, we want to type out our rule. So bringing up the keyboard, we're going to put the fraction 1 over 2 times cosine, and the fraction is 3x over 2. So we put 3x over 2 on that fraction. And then we want to graph that. So we hit the graph button, and we're going to drag our input down into that screen. And now once again, we don't get a very good look at that. So we want to change the view screen, which is the 4 arrows up the top, so that we can get a better sense of what this graph looks like. So for x, we want to go from negative 240 to positive 240. So our x minimum is negative 240, and our x maximum is 240. And our y min and y max, if we think about what the minimum y value and maximum y value is, it's negative 1/2 to positive 1/2. So I'm going to use negative 1 to 1 just to give us a little bit more view above and below the graph. And hopefully hitting OK, that'll give us a fairly good look at this graph. Now what we've got on our calculator screen is very similar to what we've got up here. So if we use analysis gsolve, and if we do root first, that will give us all of the x-intercepts. So we've got our one at minus 180, 0. We've got one at negative 60, 0. We've got one at positive 60, 0. And we've got one at 180, 0. Next, if we went analysis gsolve max, that would find the maximum points on the graph. So for this, it only finds the one that's at 0, 0.5. And trying to go left and right won't necessarily work because it doesn't understand that this graph comes down afterwards based on how we've shown the screen. What we could do is we could go analysis gsolve, and we could use xcal ycal to work out what these points are. So if I do y calculate and then put when x is negative 240 in there, that will give us the coordinate minus 240, 0.5, which is this one here. And the same thing, if I did go analysis gsolve xcal ycal, we could calculate the y value when x is now going to be positive 240. So I'll put that in the box and hit OK. And that will give us that this other coordinate down here is 240, 0.5 or 1/2. Very quickly, if we go analysis gsolve min, we can find the two minimums. So the first one that comes up is the negative 120, negative 0.5. We can hit execute to lock that on the graph, and pressing the right arrow will move us across to this one, which is at 120, negative 0.5. So now on the calculator, we've got exactly the same graph here, obviously just sketched a little bit nicer for us, and that's how we can sketch cosine graphs by hand and using a CAS calculator. So stay around and look for a few more videos that go over similar examples to this, and good luck with any of the questions that you're about to attempt.